We're going to be talking about the changing relationship between England and its colonies. When the English first established their colonies, the 13 colonies along the east coast of North America, um, the relationship between England and the colonies are good. There's strong allegiance between the colonists and the mother country and the king and the monarch, and there's no hint that there's going to be this sort of revolution, which we know to happen about a century later. And so over time, this relationship sours. It goes from good to bad. And so today we're going to focus on some of those different factors that lead to it. One of those factors is economic, and in particular, the economic system that existed during this time period was known as mercantilism. And mercantilism was a system where the mother country, in this case England, would establish colonies for the economic benefit of the mother country. And so all these colonies, like New York and Virginia, for example, had to trade with England and only England, right? So that any raw material that they found in England, in the colonies, say like lumber or any metals and things like that, would be sent back to England to be made into finished products. And likewise, those finished products then would then be brought back to the colonies and sold there, right? And the colonies couldn't go to, say, France to get those products; they had to go through England. So it was this mercantilist system was really meant to benefit the mother country. And over time, merchants in the colonies are going to get angry at this because it's preventing them from making the most money possible, and also consumers in the colonies are going to get mad because they could possibly get other goods for cheaper if there's competition, right? So say if they could decide between a French and an English company, there'd be that competition that might lower prices. In mercantilism, that's not there because you have to buy from that mother country. In addition to economic factors, there's also some political factors, right? And in particular, the Enlightenment, which is something you guys definitely talked about last year, and it's really important for understanding the American Revolution. But this idea of natural rights and representative government will eventually lead people to start questioning the authority of the king in England. But what it first does is it kind of encourages the colonists to start establishing their own representative assemblies in the colonies. So by the time we get to the start of the revolution, each colony has its own elected assembly. Granted, it was elected by a small group of white property-owning men, but it was still more democratic than just having a king or a governor. On top of that, the political situation in England changes from when the colonies are first settled to the turn of the 1700s. So under the first colonies, King Charles I, even before him, and Elizabeth I, right? They're the ones who are in charge, right? And they're kind of absolute monarchs. They have a lot of power, a lot of influence. There's a civil war in England in the 1670s and 80s. And then so we have by the 1690s, you have the establishment of the Glorious Revolution, which is when when King William and Queen Mary come to power, and on condition of coming to power, they agree to guarantee certain rights to Parliament and to the people. And so this Glorious Revolution in England supports a move towards more democratic government, and so that's going to carry over into the colonies as well. And one of the earlier things that kind of starts to aggravate some of the colonists, particularly merchants and people who benefit from it, was a bill passed in Parliament known as the Navigation Acts, and this was in 1651. And this was the British king's, the monarch and the government's attempt to stop the smuggling and trading of goods from places other than England, right? So under that mercantilist system, you could only trade with England, but the colonies, people in the colonies, illegal smugglers were trading with other people as well, undermining this mercantilist system. And so this was the effort to kind of stop that, which aggravates a lot of people because it takes money out of people's pockets. So all these things are starting to build up, right? You have these political ideas going around. You have people wanting to challenge the prevailing economic system. But one of the key catalysts or changers in this relationship is the French and Indian War. This happens from 1754 to 1763. In America, it's called the French and Indian War, but it's part of a larger conflict known as the 7 Years' War that was being fought in Europe. But the American theater of it is known as the French and Indian War. And it was a war between the two major colonial powers at the time in North America, the French and the British. And they're going to war over control of North America. Each side, the French and the British, also have different Native American tribes and nations are involved on either side, kind of as allies fighting with one side or the other. And ultimately in this war, the British win. And the war is very popular among the American colonists, right? The English colonists in America supported Britain. They wanted the French out, right? They were okay with what was happening. And as a result, the British gained control of French territory in Canada, and in modern day United States as well, like the Midwestern region of the modern day country. Um, but because they worked with certain Native American groups, the Native American allies of the British pushed the British government to limit colonial expansion, right? Because already at this point, the Native American population had been severely limited, decreased, and they were being pushed off their traditional lands. And so the Proclamation of 1763 pretty much drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains, which I'll show you in a map in a minute, that said that white colonial settlers cannot go west of that line. They had to stay east, or kind of the original colonies. This angered a lot of British colonists who thought, well, one of the expectations from the end of this war and the victory of this war was that they could then spread into what was once French territory. And it kind of, at this point, a lot of the colonists did not have the best relationship with Native Americans. And so kind of appeasing the Native Americans for this sake was not seen as a good thing in the eyes of many British colonists. Right, the frontier is the lifeline, right, of the expansion of the United States in the British colonies. On top of cutting off the frontier, the British also allowed the Catholic French Canadians to kind of live pretty independently and not pressure them at all. And at this time, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment among British Protestants, and so this was not seen as a good thing by many people. And a lot of people came to dislike the Parliament because of this decision. And on top of that, they began to more strictly enforce the Navigation Acts that had been in place since 1650. So since a century before, they began enforcing them a little bit more strongly, which again is hurting certain merchants and colonists in the 13 colonies. But what really begins to irritate and anger the British colonists is that the British government begins passing new taxes to pay for the cost of the war. Right? The British people in Britain and the Parliament thought, well, we just spent a lot of money and a lot of lives fighting and protecting you. You should pay some of that. And so, for example, in 1764, they began to tax sugar. And this is the first time that we kind of hear and see this phrase of taxation without representation. The political thought at the time was that, Parliament does not actually represent us. This was starting to emerge, this idea, that Parliament did not actually represent the American colonists because they had no representation in that colonist, in that Parliament. And so how can you tax us without us having elected representatives to, argue on our behalf? And so this begins to really sour the relationship between Parliament and the colonies. So here's just a quick map showing you the transformation of North America at this time. So at the outset of the French and Indian War in 1754, you can see on the left-hand side you have the kind of purplish color as the British territory, and the orange is the French. And then by 1763, that French territory is gone, and it's divided among the Spanish territory and England, right? So English territory expands. But on that right-hand side, you can see that red line along the Appalachian Mountains. That's that proclamation line of 1763, which attempted to limit colonial expansion into the frontier. On top of tensions with the colonies and the mother country of England, there's also internal tension. One of the most famous examples is in Virginia, and that's caused by a man named Nathaniel Bacon, and it's known as Bacon's Rebellion. And so Bacon's Rebellion, it was a group of small farm owners, so not large plantations, who began fighting with Native Americans over land and things of that sort. They kind of pleaded on behalf of to the royal governor of Virginia to help them with this, and he actually refused to give aid to these small farmers in the frontier. And so then Bacon and his supporters then turned their attention away from Native Americans and actually marched towards the colonial capital and tried to force them, and essentially took control of the capital for a little bit. Ultimately, the king recalls that governor, and a new governor comes into place and ends Bacon's rebellion by force. We also have at this time the growing predominance of slavery in the colonies, and by the 1730s and 40s, like decades leading up to the the Revolutionary War, you have a large slave population, particularly in South Carolina. And these African Americans are known to have resisted and rebelled against slavery during their period of enslavement. And so one famous example is the Stonewall Rebellion, which was in 1739. Again, that was in South Carolina. These slaves kind of rose up, killed several plantation farmers before other plantation owners armed themselves and killed the insurrectionists. Right? These uprisings happened periodically during the colonial period up until the Civil War. But the bigger picture here is also two major things, right? And one of those is a religious motivation known as the Great Awakening. And so when we have the Enlightenment period in England and Europe, before this, it's kind of not so much a move away from belief in God, but more of a move away from active religious practice. The Great Awakening is a period of religious renewal, though. So this is kind of following the Enlightenment. People begin to kind of rejoin organized churches in the 1730s and 40s in particular in the United States. And the emphasis on this renewal was not on the church hierarchies, like the Church of England or the Catholic Church, but on people's personal relationship with God. And so preachers like Jonathan Edwards, who's really famous, began preaching all throughout the 13 colonies on this idea of salvation and a personal relationship with God. And it really motivates people to kind of rejoin churches. So congregationalist churches kind of become more popular. Some Baptist churches become more popular. And this is a major religious transformation that's happening leading up to the Revolutionary War, which is going to have a connection to the Revolutionary War. We also have, though, those Enlightenment ideas never went away, right? This belief in natural rights and representative government, that people should have a say, and the ideas of John Locke that if a king is not, or if a ruler is not following through with protecting people's natural rights, those people have a right to overthrow the ruler, right? And so those ideas are going to play a huge role in leading up to the American Revolution. Great Enlightenment thinkers in the colonies, like Benjamin Franklin, for example, John Adams is another example, are people who are starting to promote these ideas and starting to write about them and get people thinking about, well, what rights should the colonists have? And ultimately, to sum it up, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, these two, one political, one religious, what they both end up doing is emphasize the individual and question traditional authority. And so since they're both doing that, once the British Crown starts doing things they don't like, well, they start saying, well, we don't have any representation as individuals. That's not right. And they start questioning this traditional authority of the king, and they're saying, maybe we're better off if we could represent ourselves. And so these two movements, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, really lay the groundwork for the American Revolution and the formation of the U.S. Constitution. And so we're going to leave it off there, and we'll pick up next time.